I'm trying to kind of get a sense for the audience here what the overall tactical situation is like, how the war has been changing, say from 2022 to even 2023 when the Ukraine side tried their big offensive, and how things are now for the Russians going forward. And what is the current status of the artillery? Because you don't hear much about that anymore. You see stuff like this with drones. You see them hitting the buildings. Nobody talks much about artillery, and the impression that some are getting is that, well, they're just not using artillery anymore. They've just gone straight to drones. What do you say?
Well, the Ukrainians have, because they're out of artillery. Look, a lot of these systems have been destroyed. They're also out of rounds. And now, by the way, they're also running out of diesel for their own stupidity on that. Because actual Russian oil that was going to places like Hungary, the Druzhba pipeline, was also returning as diesel partially to Ukraine. And there's a fuel shortage in all of Europe, diesel and aviation fuel. And that's obviously hitting the Ukrainian side. Russia is a massive producer of diesel, so there's no issues. In fact, on the fuel side, I'll tell you right off, 2 months ago when I traveled down there, there were areas with fuel issues. I won't say it was a catastrophe, but it was hard in some areas to get fuel. Lugansk, I got fuel. We carried 40 extra liters of fuel with us. In Donetsk, I had to fill it up because the fuel situation there was actually pretty bad at that point, particularly with quality of fuel. Lugansk didn't have a problem. Then we got off to Rostov and then came back. So it was in some areas it was hard, but it wasn't a total catastrophe. Now, a month ago when I traveled down with the family, I carried extra container with 20 liters of fuel, and I topped off every time I went down by a quarter. I spent maybe an extra 2 hours standing in some lines here and there to get fuel, particularly because there were a lot of fuel trucks coming in and filling up the filling stations. But there wasn't any, I wasn't under threat to run out. I just didn't want to take any risks. So every time I dropped down by a quarter, I refueled. Coming back, I was refueling maybe less than half a tank left. I wasn't worried. There's fuel everywhere. And once you got north of Voronezh, there's absolutely fuel everywhere. There's mom and pops that don't have fuel. And by the way, the Russian government's now getting on the big boys for that, because the big boys are using this excuse to try to squeeze out the mom and pops. The mom and pops buy their fuel. They don't have their own refineries, obviously. So they buy it from the big boys, the big majors that produce the fuel for their own stations, and then sell the excess fuel to the small mom and pops and small chains. And then they've been using that as an excuse to try to push out their competition. So the government's now getting on them, forcing them to start selling to the small chains and the small family fuel stations. Other than that, no, there's no issues with fuel whatsoever. But it's the same thing as what they were saying last year. Last summer, they were screaming, Russia, except it was in August. This time it was in June, in July, that Russia was out of fuel. Everybody's out of fuel. And then Reuters came out and had to admit that it wasn't 40% down. It was actually 3% down, which is, we don't want to talk about it. It's only 3% down in refinery. It's the same thing basically right now. The main targets on the refineries that they're hitting is still the fuel storage facilities, these giant tanks. Yeah. Nobody puts them out. It's pointless trying to put them out. You just cut off the pipe, the flow going in, the flow going out, and just let them burn out. But they make nice pictures for the Western press. Big fire, big smoke. But other than that, there's no fuel crisis.
Okay, so what about the artillery? What role is that playing in current ground operations?
For Russia, it's playing a lot of role, particularly because Russia's gone into even longer range artillery. Plus, a lot of the 152 millimeter artillery, they're now using rocket artillery as an addition. So you have, now I'm not talking rocket artillery like multiple launch rocket systems, but you'll have on the back of that artillery round, there's a booster. So there's a rocket booster. So when the round flies out, it switches on. It's a short burn, but it'll give you an extra 5 to 10 to 15 kilometer range on that round. And Russia, Ukraine is out of men. I mean, let's just say it the way it is. So they're trying to put these drone walls up. And to some degree, they're effective in some areas. But areas that would, before drones, an area that would be held by a platoon. Post drones was being held by a fire team, maybe. No, maybe not a fire team, but a squad. Is now being held by a fire team because they don't even have enough men to form a squad. And the drones would slow down Russian approaches. But now, there's only so many drones you can put up at a time, first of all. And Russia's still advancing, and advancing a lot faster. As a fact, additionally, what's going to be very bad for Ukrainians is in a month, so mid-September is when the fog starts rolling back in, because the climate starts to cool down just enough for big fog banks. And when those fog banks roll in, I mean, quite literally, it's a fog bank rolling in. Drones don't fly in fog banks. And that's, by the way, Russian infantry loves that fog bank. Drones don't fly in rain either, but a fog bank, the ground is still hard, but you're able to advance right up to those Ukrainian positions. And then by the time they realize you're there, you're standing over them. So that's going to start happening again in September, by mid to late September. And then the rains are going to kick in, which for Ukrainians, particularly Ukrainians in the Druzhovka, Kramatorsk, Slavinsk area, that agglomeration, they're at the end of the line. Once that rain comes in, all the people that are Ukrainian soldiers in those three cities are going to have a choice: surrender or die in place. That's it. There's not going to be any more retreating. There's no place to retreat. One of the things that's been taking so long in this war isn't that just because they fortified north to south, they also fortified in depth. So every time Russia would take one of these villages or one of these towns, the Ukrainians fall back 4, 5, 6 kilometers into the next town, into the next city. It's been fortified, and then it starts all over again. The problem for the Ukrainians on this Donbas front that they've been fortifying for the last, they started fortifying in 2014, is this is it. Everywhere else, this front's already done, and Druzhenka, Kramatorsk, and Slavisk is the last line, quite literally. Behind it is just open fields. I mean, small villages that aren't part of any line of defense. Lots of small, unprepared villages, some localized field works, which is just basically trenches and some gun positions, but they don't even have enough men to cover it, and just lots of open fields. This is it. There's nothing left. Pretty much so straight run westward toward the Dnieper and northwest toward Kharkov. So for the Ukrainians, this is a disaster when this falls. That's it. It allows Russia to move anywhere up and down that line, and pretty much so there are no major settlements. If you go down the line a little further south, you see the same thing. There's one settlement right there in gray that you have, and then after that it's Dnepropetrovsk, the city of Dnepropetrovsk, eastern Dnepropetrovsk, which is located on the east bank of the Dnieper, and then the main city is located in the west part of the Dnieper. So, except for small villages, it's pretty much just flat open land where Russia has air dominance, artillery dominance, and drone dominance. At that point,
I'm just curious, why wouldn't, or is actually more of a question than a statement, is Russia going to try to take these two fortress cities, which would probably take a lot of effort and time, as opposed to bypassing, and perhaps going through some of either the north or south and flank them and just come in from the rear? Is that anything the Russians consider? It seems like that's a big risk.
Well, they're doing it. Zoom in there, if you will. Danny, right there. Okay, so just left of the last one there is called Druzhenka, right there where you're at. That's a spur that's now been growing northwards, and that spur is going to be coming up behind Druzhenka and behind Kramatorsk to cut them off from the rear. Then on the main road from Konstantinovka in the south and from Krasny Liman in the north, you've got a pincher movement up and down this road because they're all tied to the same road. And then you have the frontal assault that's at its closest point is about 5.5 kilometers away. So Russian reconnaissance and sabotage units are already inside those cities. So you've got three approaches. You've got a frontal assault. You've got an encirclement. Well, you've got an encirclement going from north to south, and you've got an envelopment coming in from behind. So they are doing that. And Russia already has air dominance and drone dominance over the fields behind these cities. Because, by the way, Krasny Liman, which is to the north, just north of Slavinsk, that's on the high ground. See, Slavinsk is 10 kilometers, six miles away from Krasny Liman. And Krasny Liman is on the high ground, so you can see Slavinsk below you. It's laid out on an open field, basically. And that's, by the way, in World War II, that's how the Red Army freed that area from the Germans. As they came down from the north going south, because going west was too hard. There were too many built-up areas, and the Germans are fortifying. So behind that is just open fields. Now, they can still get things in and out. It's difficult, and they're losing a lot going in and out. But when the rain starts, now, you're not crossing those fields. That's black earth. That's quagmire. You're only going on hard-packed roads, and that makes ambushing by air and drone a lot easier. So those guys that are, if they're in there by mid-September, late September, they're not leaving, except as POWs.
So that's with drones and artillery. That's the roles that it's playing there, and infantrymen, of course, going in there. What about armor? Now that was a big deal when the war first started in 2022. Tank columns and all this kind of stuff played a pretty big role in 2023. Ukraine's failed offensive, and the whole Bradley graveyards and all that kind of stuff. What about now? Has the drones rendered the tanks now completely irrelevant?
No, I wouldn't say that. Tanks are still used. They're used in two roles. One, you've got these super armored up tanks that are either pine or what's the word I'm trying to find? The small animal with the spikes in every direction. I can think of the Russian word for it. I can't think of the English word for it.
The porcupine.
Hedgehog. Yeah, hedgehog.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically hedgehog tanks where they take cabling and the cable just comes out in every direction from the tank and it traps the drones. Or you have these box, what they call turtle tanks. You have the huge sheets of armor boxed in there. It really shortens the ability of the turret to turn. But if you're firing up front, you've got enough of a angle that you can still move the turret maybe about 30 degrees in either direction. But in those cases, those tanks still work and are used, but they're used relatively sparingly. The other thing that tanks are now used for is basically infantry support as direct fire weapons platforms. And that's why, by the way, Russia pulled in a bunch of old T-55 tanks, because that's, they're not capable on the battlefield anymore, but as a basically mobile infantry support gun, they're great. They don't have to get up very far up front. They come up to the line of contact, shoot off at the Ukrainian line of contact on the other side of the no man's land, and then pull back, and then go reload, drive up, shoot off again, pull back. And you don't need a very high-tech modern battle tank for that. Old tanks work just as fine. I mean, an M48 would work just as fine for that kind of role. It's a limited role. They're not going to be charging into battle anywhere. So right now, but there's been other issues. The Ukrainians have had these, from what I've been told, a couple of these, and now Russia has them also. Tanks with such high level of electronic warfare apparatus on it. People are told to button down just so you don't get brain cancer. Don't know if that's true or not, but that's they're being told.
No, we won't know until like 10 years from now.
Yeah, exactly. Wake up one morning, you got a fourth ear growing out of your forehead. Yeah, the other one you didn't even notice, or an eyeball. Yeah, but these things have such heavy electronic warfare apparatus on them that they block pretty much everything. They had a Ukrainian tank appear like that that I know of, and they just let them fire it off and then leave because it was blocking all the drones. I guess they didn't have any wire-guided drones in the area that it was operating in. And then Russian tanks have come up with the same way. So there's still a race going on. What may change all of this is the microwave weaponry. The Chinese have already, they brought 3 of these vehicles out on their last big parade. And Russia's developing them, and the U.S. is developing them too. It's EMPs. electromagnetic pulse weapon systems based on a microwave instead of a nuclear explosion. And their area effect, because you can bring in laser systems. Russia's got laser systems. U.S. has laser systems because we know they fired on a balloon, party balloon in Mexico across the border. That was in the news. The lasers will, at 5 kilometers, it's half a second, and you melt right through one of these drones. But the problem is you only service one target at a time. So if you have 40, 50 drones coming in and a large dispersion pattern, you're not going to be able to take them out. They'll take you out before you can take all of them out. And lasers are expensive. Laser systems are expensive. These systems that the Chinese are ahead of both Russia and the U.S., these are area effect weapon systems. They create an electromagnetic pulse. It burns out, and it's a long pulse. It burns out all the electronics, unprotected electronics. So it doesn't matter if the drone's flying by radio, by artificial intelligence, or by by cable. It's going to burn because it's got a chipset in there. Of course, it's going to burn anybody's car out and everything else that's in that area. But that's how that goes. It'll burn your radios out. It'll burn anything out that's electronic and its area of effect. But that's something that may return maneuver warfare. Drones will always be there. But if this pans out, it could be a game changer.
Yeah, I was going to say that's one of the few that if you could get that, especially with how this is slogged out for the last 3 years, if all of a sudden you can get even in a narrow portion of a front where all of a sudden the enemy loses the capability of having drones in the air, now you can maneuver without fear of that, and that would until somebody else figures a counter for it, that could provide at least a periodic game changer, which could be decisive when you're trying to win a war. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and he was saying what they're seeing from the Ukrainian side is obviously the Ukrainians have lost a lot of drone operators because they've seen the drones that are coming in are much worse operated than before. They're more janky. They don't have as good a control. So it just shows that the people behind the controls are less tactically advanced. Yeah, they're not as proficient at them. They basically give them the minimal training and shove them up there because their casualty rates are just too high. And what they're saying is the moment they see a drone in an area, as soon as any suspected place where these drone operators may be, plus there's drones, Russian drones in the skies constantly looking, recon drones, they just artillery the hell out of anything that any position they may be at. Because these drone operators, these FPV drone operators, they're actually pretty close up to the front. Sometimes they're at the front line itself, the contact line. They'll find some house or some grove of trees, and they start launching from that area. But they usually get very close to the front line to maximize their distance and reaction time. But that also puts them into under surveillance, and surveillance in this case means destruction by rocket artillery or by tube artillery.
And so, lastly, what is the level of I guess the Ukrainian side, their manpower density, how many they have, and their ability to do the same to try and strip away the Russian drone operators?
Oh, yeah, Russia also loses drone operators. That's not, I won't deny that, of course. But Russia has reorganized and gone full tilt on drone operators. What I mean by that is earlier, you didn't have dedicated battalions of drones as part of your anti-aircraft systems. And drones, there's a lot of different missions for drones that require different equipment. You've got reconnaissance drones. You've got drones that go up there to as relay stations. You've got drones that drop grenades on top of targets. You got kamikaze drones. You've got resupply drones, and all of that requires different equipment. What until recently was happening was every battalion, every company, every platoon, and sometimes every section may have their own drone operator. They're equipped with whatever they can buy or whatever volunteers bring in, some what the military is providing. So it's all different equipment. It's not specialized per se. So it was kind of hodgepodge approach that started in late 22 and continued. Right now, everything's changed over the last half a year. fully reorganized. And while battalions may individually still have their drone sections, now you have drone battalions. And these guys, there's professional schools that have gone up. They're recruiting heavily and getting a lot of people in, because there's also, post-war, being an expert drone operator is going to be a well-paying job. Drones aren't going anywhere in the civilian side either, just expanding. So these guys are now dedicated units that can actually cover a large area and carry out very specific missions.
Yeah, and that is obviously part of the larger, what we would call in our military, the joint force, and that all goes together. Let me ask you this question, because you were in the U.S. military. I don't. How many years ago was it the last time you left the U.S. any service?
2004. Yeah, it's been a while.
So it's been a while, but I presume you probably still pay attention to what the U.S. Army is doing, especially as NATO forces, stuff that's in the open. What you have described here throughout this whole episode here is quite a number of things that are because the Russian armed forces had to evolve. So did the Ukrainian side, and they've been doing this in parallel for the most part. It is dramatically different than it was in February 2022 on both sides of the line. I have seen incremental changes, minimal incremental changes in the Western way of warfare. And you were talking about like the proliferation of gun trucks throughout scores of kilometers from the front line. You're talking about these anti-drone capabilities. You're talking about the pro-drone capabilities, the change of the tanks with the turtle decks, the hedgehogs. I mean, any kind of repurposing them, etc. How far would you say that the U.S. is, and we'll just maybe even just limit it to the drone battalions that you have in the specialization and the fact that you have specialized looking for the drone operators on the other side. If we suddenly, where we are right now, there was a fight between NATO and Russia, and the NATO forces, U.S., French, British, whatever, they all came over, and now they have to go up against the current Russian armed forces, land forces. What would we expect to see?
Well, first of all, one of the reasons drones are effective is because the front's moving, but it's moving relatively slowly. One of the reasons the front is moving relatively slowly is because Russia's minimalizing its own casualties. It moves up, it hits some kind of resistance, brings in artillery, brings in drones, starts destroying everything, and then that's part of that attrition warfare. Earlier the Ukrainians would come to you, now you kind of got to go to them. But when you dominate in artillery and dominate in aviation and drones, for the most part, you can afford that. You're going slow. But on the flip side, Russia's also preparing for a big war with Europe because, everybody hears whatever the Europeans are saying constantly, every day. War. Russia's manufacturing well over 1,000 new main battle tanks, T-90 Prorivs, which means T-90 breakthroughs, every year for the last 3 years or 2.5 years. So that's about 3,000. There's maybe 2.5, 3,000, 4,000, somewhere around there. I won't say exactly. New battle tanks, and these aren't going to Ukraine. These are being prepared for a big war with Europe. So I think if that happens, it's going to be a very different conflict, at least initially. On the flip side, from what I've seen, what I've seen from the NATO training videos that they've been putting out for all these different training exercises, they haven't changed anything. They've just mostly ignored everything that's been on the Ukrainian front for the last 4 years. But we saw that with the Israelis too. Drones were a reality for 1.5 years when the Israelis started their slightly genocidal drive to exterminate Gaza and into southern Lebanon. And where the Hamas was hitting them with drones, Hezbollah's hitting them with drones, especially Hezbollah. By that point, it was 2 years of drone warfare. It was more than 2 years of drone warfare. And you see these columns of Israeli Merkava tanks driving in with no grills, no anything. They're just as if they're going on a tank ride. And Hamas was or Hezbollah, I'm sorry, was just taking them apart with drones. So a lot of these armies, it's the leadership, obviously. Number one, it's the leadership. They're either mentally incapable of adapting or they're in denial. I mean, the reality is at least for now, until you get microwave weapon systems for EMPs, maneuver warfare is gone. on a large scale, unless you're ready to take serious casualties. I mean, serious casualties. Russia could break through, but it would be, at least in the first days, it would be very heavy casualties, because that's and it would be very visible heavy casualties to break through. But once the front starts rolling, it could be something different. But that's the reality. But yeah, the West, it's just been incredible watching this. I've seen some of the videos of the French, for example, doing urban warfare, and it's just ludicrous. You're looking at people bunching up behind tanks, and on these NATO exercises, same thing. It's the same thing. It's a breakthrough. You got the tank coming in, or you got the armored infantry fighting vehicle coming in. Everybody's behind it, trotting along. You're just thinking one drone, and it's gonna be like 5 or 6 dead and a bunch more injured, because that entire infantry squad that's right behind that tank. You got one drone with an RPG round coming in there. That's it, and you're minus a squad, and nothing's changed. I think it's incredible to watch. People ignore. It reminds me of World War I. All these colonial powers had machine guns, and they used them very liberally against some African tribes and Southeast Asia. They used machine guns liberally, but they somehow never figured the machine guns worked just as well against them. And when they charged in against those machine guns, they did the same thing that they were doing to the spear chuckers. They were doing to the European armies.
Yeah,
and it just seems the same thing. They refuse to learn, it's an interesting psychosis. I don't know how else to call it.
And I hope this stays in the intellectual realm and we don't have to actually observe it, because that'll be bad for everybody. But listen, I really appreciate you giving us this kind of FPV view, if you will, of the battlefield, about what's been going on at the granular level. We rarely get that in the Western media at all anymore. So we really appreciate you coming on today and sharing us with what's going on.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
And